evening, everyone, and welcome to all of you that's joining us tonight. I'm Professor Jeanette Maritz, and I will be facilitating tonight's session. So tonight we're looking at selecting a methodology and a research design, but we're specifically focusing on mixed method research designs. So as always, there will be opportunity for you in the question and answer section that we will be addressing after the presentation. So if there's anything that's not clear or if you have questions, you're welcome to post it there, and I will have a look at it after the presentation. As always as well, you will receive the presentation after tonight's event. So do not worry, you will receive all the information. And with that, I am going to start tonight's presentation. And for the presentation itself, I'll be closing my camera, but as soon as we have the question and answer session, I will share my face again. Then, so for tonight's session, we're going to specifically look at mixed method research design. So for tonight's workshop, we're going to have a very brief overview of the qualitative and quantitative research paradigms and research methods, just in a very short slide, just to orientate you again in terms of the words we use in the two paradigms, what do we aim to do with this type of research, what kind of methods are used in the two types of qualitative and quantitative research designs, because we will be referring back to a lot of those concepts and the methodologies as we speak about mixed method research. Now, as we have a look at what is qualitative and quantitative designs, what do we aim to do with those, and how do they then relate to a mixed method research design? So when we look at qualitative research versus quantitative research, the purpose of these types of designs are different. So the purpose of qualitative research is to explore, to discover, to understand phenomena, their meanings, and potentially to develop theory. Where in quantitative research, we want to either potentially test hypotheses, explain certain variables or measure variables, or we want to quantify data. So this is very, very important to remember. So the purpose of qualitative research is to explore, and quantitative research to explain. Now, for qualitative research, at the end of the process, we can potentially develop theory, where in quantitative research, we test theory. So keep that in mind. In qualitative research, our nature of data is non-numerical, so it's either textual or visual, or it can be sound-based, but it is not numeric. Quantitative research is numeric and statistical. So the nature of data, qualitative is words and visuals. Quantitative, we're working with numbers. So data collection also differs. In qualitative research, we would typically use interviews, focus groups, observation, sometimes document analysis. But these interviews, focus groups, observations are all translated into words. And therefore we work with words. Where in quantitative research, we're looking at surveys, experiments, secondary data analysis, where we work with numbers. So typically the sample size of a qualitative design is smaller, and we use purposive sampling, where we have inclusion-exclusion criteria, and we're looking for potential participants that have a lived experience or with documents that can tell us more in terms of documents. With quantitative research, we typically have large samples, and we often use, for instance, random sampling. Now, when we analyze qualitative research, it's often thematic, content analysis, narrative analysis, where in quantitative research, we're working with numbers and therefore usually statistical analysis, which is either descriptive or inferential. Now, the outcome of these two types of design is very important. So the outcome of a qualitative design is to gather in-depth understanding of a phenomenon, and we want rich descriptions. Where in quantitative research, we usually generalize findings, and we may at the end posit some predictions or testing in terms of theory. So the strengths of a qualitative design lies in the depth of insight, and it's very context specific, the understanding, where in quantitative research, we're looking at a broad application with precision and the ability to replicate. Now, each of these designs have limitations as well. Now, this is also very important to note as we carry on with our discussion tonight. Now, the limitations of a qualitative design is limited generalizability because it's so context specific. And there's also an element of subjectivity. Now, in quantitative research, with its broad application, it often lacks depth and it strips context. So just some designs in terms of the two designs. Qualitative designs are ethnography, grounded theory, case studies, narrative research, so very much people, text based. Where in quantitative research, we're looking at designs such as experimental design, survey research, correlation studies, pre-test, post-test studies, and so on. So these strengths and limitations are very important to note as we go forward and speak about the mixed method research designs. So there's often a confusion in terms of the concepts in mixed method research. And I am already preempting questions, and therefore I'm starting with this. So mixed method research versus multi-method research. The difference is in mixed method research, we integrate qualitative, quantitative methods within a single study to answer research questions comprehensively. Now, this very aspect, this first word, is critical to remember. When we do mixed method research, at some stage or at stages in the research, we are integrating findings to answer our research questions. And that is the very important concept to remember, is this integration that takes place. Now, in multi-method research, we use multiple methods within a single paradigm, either qualitative or quantitative, without integrating different types of data. So in example of mixed method research could, for instance, be using surveys, which are quantitative in nature, and interviews, qualitative, to study patient satisfaction and integrating the data. So, for example, when we use the surveys to measure patient satisfaction, we might have certain concepts or certain data that we want to explore in greater depth, and the interviews would allow for that. Where in multi-methods, we combine different types of surveys, for instance, quantitative, to gather data. So very important, this aspect of integration that takes place. So if we look at the definition of mixed method research, it's a research methodology that involves collecting, analyzing, and here comes the word again, integrating quantitative, for example, experiments or surveys, and qualitative, for instance, interviews, focus groups, data in a single study. So the goal here is to draw on the strengths and minimize the weaknesses of both types of research to answer research questions more comprehensively. So if you recall the very first slide, we had certain strengths that each type of design gives us, and there were certain limitations that each design had. So what we are doing here is we are integrating the two designs to minimize the weakness and to maximize the strengths of each of these research designs in a single design where we aim to integrate these findings. And we'll talk about what this integration entails in a minute. So the core components is in the data collection, we use both qualitative and quantitative methods. In the data analysis, we integrate data at one or more stages of the research process. And then the interpretation, we are combining insights from both data sets to provide a more robust understanding. You will see that under a number of slides, there are references for you in terms of more up-to-date publications. So in this case, it was Plana Clark and Ivankova, and this was their second edition. Just maybe check if there's an edition after that. But if you understand the concept that there is an integration of two sets of data at one or more stages of the research process, you will already be well on your way in understanding what we mean by mixed method research. So when we talk about mixed method research, now often the question now arises, in which paradigms does mixed method research fall? So remember, we said qualitative research often is interpretivist, constructivist paradigms, where in quantitative research we work in a positivist paradigm. So now the question arises, so if we use, if we're working in both paradigms, then when we start mixing methods, we would now be thinking in terms of paradigms, and where does these mixed method research then fall? So there's potentially 4 paradigms that your mixed method design, research designs could fall. Very often it falls under a pragmatist paradigm or pragmatism, because we are focusing on the practical research outcomes and solving practical problems. So when we use mixed method designs, we want to solve complex problems, and therefore we need data from both qualitative and quantitative paradigms. So very often mixed method research falls in the pragmatist or pragmatism paradigm. It also could fall under a transformative paradigm where we would like to emphasize social justice and change, for instance. Or it can be a dialectical paradigm where we integrate diverse paradigms, perspectives, and methods, or critical realism, where we combine a realist and interpretivist approaches. So, but for the most, we will find our mixed method research within a pragmatist paradigm where we are specifically combining two designs for practical reasons, because we want to explore either complex phenomena or a phenomena in greater depth to answer research questions. So we'll talk in more depth about research questions, because they are very important in how we formulate them for our mixed method research design. But if you can understand that mixed method research can potentially fall under these four paradigms, then you also have a paradigmatic perspective from which you can embed your research. So constructivism, more qualitative, post-positivism, more positivism, more quantitative, post-positivism, where we already start acknowledging complexity and multiple realities. Okay, so we've now covered what qualitative research looks like, quantitative, the strength of each of these designs, and what paradigms they might fit in. So next, let's maybe just spend a minute or two in looking at what are the key features and benefits of a mixed method research design. So because there's an integration of data, and we're combining both qualitative and quantitative data during analysis and later interpretation to provide a fuller understanding of the research problem. So key features also is that these data collection, when we do data collection within our mixed methods research, this can be either sequential or it can be concurrent. So sequential meaning that we can collect, for instance, quantitative data first and then qualitative data, or it can happen at the same time. And these methods are then also complementary, where the one method complements and enhances the findings of others. And then, as we said, the pragmatic approach, being flexible and adaptable to the needs of the research question. And you will gather in the time that we focus on the research questions very particularly when we speak about mixed method research. And there's another reference for you. So the benefits, therefore, of using mixed method research is that we have a comprehensive perspective, which provides a more complete picture by combining the depth of qualitative data with the generalizability of quantitative data. It also enhances the validation, because we can do a cross-verification of findings through multiple methods and increase the credibility and the validity of the results. And again, the research question, we can look at more complex research questions suitable for addressing complex problems that cannot be fully explored using a single method. Also, the richness of data. So mixed method research generates richer data, more nuanced data by capturing different dimensions of the research problem. Now, very important by this stage, if you are still in the proposal stage or you are now looking at designs, once you have an idea of what your focus area is and the problem is that you want to address, the next question would then maybe be, when do we use mixed method research? So from the start, we would consider mixed method research when we are looking at a complex phenomena. So when the research topic involves complex phenomena that cannot be fully understood using either qualitative or quantitative designs and methods alone. So, for example, studying the impact of social media on mental health, which involves both measurable behavior and personal experiences. We can use mixed method research design when we want exploratory and confirmatory results. So where there's a need to explore the phenomena, for instance, qualitative, and then subsequently test the test hypothesis or confirm findings in a quantitative manner. For example, exploring initial attitudes towards a new educational intervention and then measuring its effectiveness through pre and post tests. So you can see that when we use mixed method research, it adds layers. And with the layers, there's complexity in terms of the design as well. Now, as soon as complexity starts coming in, I know there's many of you that will now wonder, can I use mixed method research designs in my master's study? And because of that, I would strongly suggest that you don't use mixed methods research designs in a master's study, simply because you don't have the time, neither do you have the resources to do a qualitative study and a quantitative study and then integrate the findings to answer a very complex problem. Now, if there are some of you whose supervisor says you must do this on a master's level, I'm not going to oppose that, but personally, I wouldn't suggest doing this on a master's level. Certainly, this is an ideal design for a PhD study where you have more time to complete your study, you potentially have more resources to do that, and you are on a PhD level probably more au fait with both quantitative and qualitative research, and you have a bit more experience. So if there isn't any opposition from your supervisor, I wouldn't suggest mixed method research on a master's level. So when I mentioned the different research questions and the whole area around research questions, we must remember that we need questions in both of the phases, qualitative and quantitative, and then research questions regarding the integration and what happens with that. So, for example, you investigating both the extent of a problem quantitatively and the reason behind it qualitatively. So we can, through our discussion, you could imagine that these are multi-phase projects. So you could imagine that the qualitative component is a project on its own. The quantitative phase is a project on its own. And then when the integration interpretation comes about, it's type of a project on its own. So very often in large-scale multi-phase projects where different phases require different methodological approaches. For example, a longitudinal study, which I don't think any of you will do because you don't have the time, a longitudinal study examining both the statistical trends and personal narratives of career development over time. So you might not be involved in large-scale projects on a master's or PhD level, but in a smaller, more contained way, your research would also have phases. Now, we need to remember that concept of the phases when we talk about the different mixed method research designs in a moment. So the cross-validation is also useful when there's a need to cross-validate and corroborate findings from different methods. So for example, using surveys to quantify employee satisfaction and interviews to understand the underlying reason and context. When we look at context and measurement, when the context is crucial to understand quantitative findings or when qualitative insights need quantification for broader applications. So, for example, quantifying patient satisfaction in a healthcare setting while also understanding individual patient stories and their experiences. So now we come to the different types of mixed method designs. So the text might be a bit small, but as I said, you will receive the slides. But in terms of the mixed method research designs, there are potentially a number of designs that we could choose. The first being an embedded design, and I'll explain that now. Then we could have exploratory design. We could have an explanatory design. So remember, when we just started, we spoke about quantitative research being more exploratory, more explanatory, and qualitative being more exploratory. So here comes the wording in terms of an exploratory or an explanatory design. And you can then imagine if we're doing an explanatory design, then the quantitative phase might come first and have greater weight. So there are a number of types of mixed method designs that we can have a look at. Now, the first type of design is an embedded design. And what we mean by that is that it involves incorporating one type of a data within a larger design framework. So typically, one method plays a supportive role and the other a secondary role within a primary method. So for instance, a primary method drives the study, for instance, quantitative, and a secondary method provides supplementary insights, for instance, the qualitative. So when we use embedded designs, it could be when we're looking at complementing, when secondary data is needed to provide additional context or understanding, or we want supportive insights when the primary data needs to be supplemented with additional insights that are not possible to gather in one method alone. So, for example, using a qualitative case study, which is the larger design, within a larger quantitative survey to provide in-depth understanding of survey results. Now, the embedded design is often less prominent because this embeddedness can take place at different phases of the project. But there are some advantages in that it adds contextual depth, but that we would find in any of the mixed method designs. It is more flexible, could enhance your understanding, but the complexity of integration can be challenging with different types of data, and it's very resource intensive and requires additional resources and time to collect the secondary data. And there's a potential of misalignment between the primary and secondary data. But what is very often used and more commonly referred to is the explanatory and exploratory designs. So when we speak about an explanatory mixed method research design, explanatory, quantitative. Remember when we said what is the purpose? Explanatory will kind of give the reader an idea that the quantitative aspect of the project is maybe heavier or comes first. So when we're looking at explanatory design, it involves using quantitative methods first to collect and analyze data, followed by qualitative methods to help explain or interpret the quantitative findings. So in the process, we would collect and analyze quantitative data, and then we would collect and analyze qualitative data to explain the quantitative results. So we typically use this explanatory design when we want clarification. For example, the initial quantitative results needs further exploration or clarification. Or we might have unexpected findings when the quantitative results are unexpected or require deeper understanding. For example, if we conduct a survey on student performance and we follow up with interviews to explore the reason behind the performance trends. So the advantages of an explanatory design, we can have sequential insights. So it provides clear sequential insights. By sequential, we mean first the one and then the other. Where we can then explain with qualitative data the quantitative results. We can have more detailed explanations, and it helps in understanding the underlying reason behind, for instance, statistical trends. We can have advanced interpretation, facilitating a deeper interpretation of quantitative findings. The disadvantage, and this will come up virtually with all mixed method designs, is that it's time consuming and it requires a longer time frame due to the sequential phases. Also then resource demanding, demands significant resources to conduct both phases effectively. And then the complexity where it involves complex data integration and analysis. So with the exploratory designs, we are now focusing exploratory. Remember, the aim of qualitative designs is to explore and describe. So exploratory designs gives us a hint that the qualitative aspect might be the start and or has greater weight. So in exploratory design, it involves using qualitative methods first to explore a phenomena, followed by a quantitative method to potentially test or generalize the initial findings. So the process would be that you collect and analyze qualitative data to explore a topic, and then phase 2 to collect and analyze quantitative data to test and generalize the qualitative findings. So we can use this in an initial exploration when little is known about the research problem, and we need this initial exploration. So for instance, we can, if you're using, for instance, a grounded theory approach where you don't know a lot about a problem, you could start with a qualitative exploration and then build on. So with qualitative research, remember we said we are developing, or we could develop theory. So when developing a new theory or hypothesis, that requires initial qualitative insights. So, for example, conducting focus groups to understand consumer preferences and then using a survey to measure these preferences on a larger scale. Another example could be, for instance, if you don't know a lot about a problem, and the first phase, you collect qualitative data, and then based on the qualitative findings, you identify concepts and constructs which can then also help you to develop a survey instrument, which you can then use for further exploration or for more to hone in on a specific problem in more depth. So the advantages of exploratory designs is in the grounded insights that it provides us, and it could then inform subsequent quantitative testing. Theory building, it facilitates theory building and hypothesis generation. The flexibility, it allows for initial exploration before committing to a quantitative study, for example. Now, the disadvantage is the sequential dependency of this design. So findings from the first phase must inform the second phase, creating a dependency. Now, I can, for instance, give you an example of a PhD student of mine that initially thought he could just create a survey based on literature. But when I suggested that he does a qualitative interviews first, he realized that there were much more that could be explored in this survey other than what he had found in literature. So the qualitative findings with the literature allowed him to have a more robust survey that he could then explore in further depth. But that meant that he needed to complete the literature review, complete the qualitative interviews, analyze the interviews, get the findings to then progress to the survey development. So there's a dependency in terms of doing certain phases sequentially. So you can imagine that requires extended time to complete both phases. And then again, the resource intensiveness, and it demands considerable resources for comprehensive data collection and data analysis in the first phase, and then the sequential phases after that to complete a project. So maybe just then, we've spoken about the explanatory and exploratory sequential designs, but these can also be convergent and parallel designs, where we can collect data for both phases at the same time. So that is then convergent. So we would do both of these phases and then compare or relate and then interpret. So there's then a convergence between the quantitative and the qualitative results, where in explanatory sequential designs, you would start and the quantitative aspect would usually have more weight, and then the qualitative analysis would then lead to the interpretation. The same with exploratory, the weight would there be more to the qualitative side, and it builds to quantitative data collection and then ends with the interpretation. So you might find that it is when you look at these designs, they might have for instance, in an explanatory sequential design, they might write it as the quan in capital letters, QUAN, and then qual in lowercase, which gives an indication that the quantitative component has greater weight or that it comes first. And they might write both quan and qual, both with capital letters, and that could indicate a convergent parallel design. Or with exploratory design, qual in capital letters, quan in lowercase. So very often you also find in textbooks that they would present these different designs in this way to indicate to the reader which comes first, and or at times which has greater weight. So just to recap then, we've got different mixed method designs. These different designs is based on which project comes first, or which has more weight, or which informs the one or the other. And they can be in sequence, or they can be convergent, running at the same time. But what is very, very important, and we go back to the initial slides, in that it's very important that we remember that at some stage there's an integration of these results findings in order to then interpret and complete the project. Okay, so there's a lot of theoretical loading. So if you're kind of starting to feel fuzzy, there's just about 12 more slides. So just bear with the process. Okay, so in terms of the steps in designing a multi-method research design, as with any project, we would define the problem and the objectives, and then aligned with these objectives. So now you need to remember that you would need objectives for both phases as well as the integration phase. So you would need objectives for the qual or the quan aspect, and potentially an objective for when integration takes place, and potentially then, if it's a PhD study, the contribution. So at the least or the minimum, there might be 4 objectives. Now, aligned with the objectives, we will have research questions. So there would be more than one question to align with each of the research methods. And then we need to then decide which would be the appropriate mixed method research design. So you need to then decide which aspect needs to go first. Are they going sequentially? Are they going parallel? Which needs to be before, which needs to be after, and in what sequence you're going to have it, and which design would then be best to address the research problem and answer your objectives and questions. So you need to then outline the data collection. So that would then be data collection for both the qualitative and the quantitative component, and then the integration phase. So once you've done that conceptualization of your design, you would gather your qualitative, quantitative data, and then you would have a separate analysis and then integrate the findings. So remember, I said earlier, but the integration may take place at different phases of the project, or once you have collected both data sets. So just going back to developing the research questions, and maybe just give you some examples. Remember, we said we are addressing more complex problems and more complex questions. So for instance, how do socioeconomic factors and individual psychological resilience interact to influence academic performance among university students during a global pandemic? So now you can see that there's a socioeconomic factors, and then also a specific look at the individual psychological resilience and their interaction to influence academic performance. So you can already see the complexity of this one research question, which then has multiple aspects that it would require to address. So there's multiple layers of influence: the social economic factors and the psychological resilience on academic performance. So when we then look at a mixed method approach, we might have a quantitative component where we do a survey to measure socioeconomic status, psychological resilience, and academic performance, for instance. And then we might follow up with in-depth interviews with students to explore their personal experiences and challenges and coping strategies, for instance, during the pandemic. And then when the integration takes place, we combine the quantitative data, for example, the statistical correlations, with the qualitative insights to provide a comprehensive understanding of the different factors and the interaction and the impact on academic outcomes. So in this example, you can see there is it's quite a complex set of questions in one. So when we look at exploratory sequential questions, exploratory, remember, exploratory is qualitative, so that phase would go first. Therefore, the questions would then, for instance, look at what are the lived experience of individuals undergoing a specific phenomena, or the experience of a specific phenomena, which is qualitative. And then how prevalent are these experiences in a larger population? So, for example, exploring the experiences of remote work during the pandemic, and then measuring the prevalence of a specific challenge among remote workers. Now, the example of the pandemic comes up, but it could be any disaster. For instance, natural disasters. We've got flooding now, so it's not just thinking about the pandemic, for instance, but any potential risk that could take place. So in explanatory, remember we said explanatory quantitative goes first. So what are the quantitative outcomes, for instance, of a specific intervention? And then following it up with a qualitative question: how do participants describe their experience with the intervention? For example, measuring the improvement in test scores after a new teaching method, and then exploring students' experiences with the method through interviews. And just an example of convergent questions. So what are patterns and trends in the data, which is more quantitative, and how do individuals perceive and explain these patterns? Qualitative. So these questions can be explored at the same time and converge. So, for example, analyzing survey data on consumer behavior, and then conducting focus groups to understand the motivations behind these behaviors. But these questions can, for instance, also be the data could be potentially be collected at the same time. If we look at questions for the embedded design, for instance, what's the impact of an intervention on specific outcomes, more quantitative, and how do participants engage with the intervention during its implementation, more qualitative. So, for example, evaluating the effectiveness of a health promotion program through health metrics and observing participants' interaction during the program activities. Then some multi-phase questions. So, for instance, how do initial qualitative findings inform subsequent quantitative measurements and vice versa? For instance, conducting an initial qualitative study to develop a survey, the example that I gave you, then using the survey to gather quantitative data, followed by qualitative follow-ups or interviews to delve deeper into the quantitative results. So you have a qualitative phase followed by quantitative phase followed by a qualitative phase again. So these are multi-phase questions. Now just some remarks in terms of the strategies for data analysis. So the data analysis will be according to the type of data that you collected. So, for instance, you could do a separate analysis, analyze the qualitative and quantitative data independently. Or you could use a thematic analysis and identify themes and patterns in qualitative data, and then follow up, for instance, with a quantitative data analysis method in terms of survey results or statistical analysis. So you could perform statistical tests on quantitative data, do a comparative analysis where you compare findings from both data sets, or you can do a concurrent analysis where you're doing the analysis simultaneously for real-time integration, or do a sequential analysis where you analyze with one type of data first, followed by the other. So in broad, it just says that you can, the data analysis strategy will also link to the design, the mixed method research design that you chose. Is it exploratory? Is it explanatory? Is it embedded? And where does the integration then take place? So your data analysis will align tightly with that. We're nearly coming to the end of the slides, just in terms of rigor in mixed method designs. So each type of a design, you would know that in qualitative and quantitative research, we look at rigor a bit differently. So the same would go for mixed method designs. We would still, for instance, with our surveys, have looking at validity, reliability, using statistical validation techniques. We in qualitative designs, we will look at credibility, dependability, confirmability, and then we might then, with the cross-validation with multiple data sources, also need to look at the rigor of each data source and the collection thereof and the subsequent analysis. Now, the integration technique is with mixed method. There's metrics and joint displays for data integration. So we need to ensure through the mixed method research phases or projects that we are aligned in terms of the validity, reliability, or the trustworthiness within a stage, in order to be transparent as well in exactly what we did when, to where we use triangulation to enhance results, and be upfront about that. So the same with the ethical considerations, that would be the same as you would have for any other type of a research design. What I've done now, and we are nearing the end, is I've done a short checklist of questions for designing a mixed method research design, that you can maybe just, if you have thought out or about your mixed method research design, maybe just ask yourself the following questions. Have you defined a mixed method research design? Do you justify using mixed method research for your problem and questions? Have you collected both qualitative and quantitative data? Have you described your intent for collecting both forms of data? And do you have an integration statement? Have you identified the type of MMR design? And have you provided, for instance, a diagram of your design? The issue around the visual explanation of your design is it's usually easier for the reader to get a visual roadmap. But in mixed method research designs, it's especially important because you've worked with it intensively. It's very clear to you. But the person reading your thesis for the first time might not find it that transparent and that easy to follow. So having a visual map of the design and the processes, which phase is first, the data collection, the data analysis, where the integration takes place in a diagram, for instance, or a visual picture, would help the reader, which for your thesis is the examiner, to understand the roadmap of your design. As we said, we're working with complex problems, complex questions to answer, and usually more complex design. So be kind to your reader and provide them with a diagram of your design, or a visual picture of it. Have you identified how you will analyze the data for integration? It's very useful to use joint displays for this. Have you drawn a conclusion or a meta inference from analyzing the integration? So this is the culmination of your mixed method research design, is your conclusion or your meta inference based on analyzing and integration then. So very often then in a thesis, this might culminate in your unique contribution to knowledge. So a very, very important phase or aspect that you need to include and make very clear. And then have you discussed the validity or validity and reliability and trustworthiness in the different phases, and the ethics of your study. So this is basically a summary of everything that we spoke about tonight. So if you can answer these questions and tick off that you have addressed all of these, even in your proposal, this would need to be ticked off for your proposal. If you're using a mixed method research design, remember you're going to fully explain both phases, qualitative, quantitative, or the other way around. You're going to fully explain the data collection methods for each, the data analysis for each, the integration, and then your conclusion. So it would be like you have two projects. And then in addition, you would then still have the integration and your meta inference based on the findings and the integration of these. So I hope this has more or less given you a broad outline of what we speak about. So if you can remember that we work in different paradigms, you will have to complete projects where at some stage the one either informs the other, or there's an integration of data at some or multiple places in order to then answer complex questions, to solve complex problems. The next slide really is also just other examples, but I've come to the end of the slides. So I'm going to go to the question and answer section. I just want to go to some of the initial slides, maybe just to keep you refreshed. And then we'll go over to the questions, and hopefully I can provide some clarification if you need. I just need to maximize my window again. Just give me a chance to go to the chat so that it uploads to the question and answer, so that it just uploads. I'm nearly there, so please keep your notes and your comments. There seems to be 6 questions. Okay, the very first one is, good evening, Prof. In your experience, what are the common recurring mistakes that students make when using mixed method research? I often think that the students don't realize the scope of work that's involved when choosing a mixed method research design. It really is a large scope to complete, even for a PhD. So realizing the time involved, not just in the initial planning and proposal of this design, it's working with nearly 2 PhDs in one, and then some. So often underestimating the weight of this design in terms of time and resources. And then the other thing that I often see is that students don't have the integration phase. So they go up to the quan and the qual, but then they stop there, and there isn't the integration. And that's in most. Also, very often it's quite a steep learning curve if you do not know both qualitative and quantitative research design. So I often find that students are more au fait with the one or the other. And then other than the time and the research constraints, they still need to also work in another research design, either qualitative or quantitative, that they might not have done yet. So there's a lot of benefits to it. So I'm not saying that that you shouldn't do it. I'm just saying that you need to know what you're signing up for, and that there might be some additional learning in terms of potentially another design, another way of data analysis that you might not have used before, because it's very unlikely that you would have used in a master study, you would have potentially only used either qualitative or quantitative methods. So now in a PhD, you would need to learn about the other design as well, how to collect data, how to analyze their data, validity, reliability, trustworthiness, whichever design it is. So the learning curve is sometimes quite steep, but there's certain problems or certain phenomena that really just lends itself to mixed method research. For instance, the example that I shared of the student that I spoke about. There really wasn't another way other than a mixed method. But I can see how much slower, for instance, his progress is compared to another student, for instance, that only used a qualitative grounded theory study. So I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. There's a lot of benefits. So if you are doing it, just realize the scope, and then you take it on like an elephant, bit by bit. So not saying you shouldn't do it. Okay, but also always remember the integration. Good evening, Prof. Kindly differentiate between thematic analysis and Atlas TI. Okay, a thematic analysis is a way of analyzing qualitative data, and Atlas TI is a program that can help you with thematic analysis. So Atlas TI is a qualitative data analysis software program. But thematic analysis is a type of analysis that you do, and you can use the software to assist you in doing the analysis. But please, when you are using Atlas TI, it's not the same as a statistical analysis package where you put the data in and it does the work for you and it spits out, sorry for the words, but at the end it gives you the analysis. It's not the same with Atlas TI. You can put in your interviews, the transcribed interviews, if you have pictures, anything like that, it keeps everything nice and in the same place. But you would still need to do the thematic analysis. Atlas just provides you with the tools to for instance, analyze your data, but it doesn't do the analysis for you. All right, so please remember that the analysis process is still happening. Yeah. So the program isn't going to do it for you. There is, in the latest Atlas edition, there is an AI component built into it, but you still need to supervise the process. So I hope that clarifies it in terms of that. Dear Prof, is it advisable to use sequential exploratory MMR to develop a model or guidelines? Yeah, sequential, fine, if you're then starting with a qualitative component, and you can build a model or guidelines based on that. And if you're building a model, you can, for instance, evaluate it or statistically look at, the measuring after the model development. But usually, if you are developing a model, please make sure that you really need a mixed method research design to develop a model, because you could do that, for instance, with a qualitative study on its own or with a quantitative study. So yes, you can. The short answer is yes, you can. Just make 100% sure whether you need a mixed method research for it. Is there a difference between a research question and a research problem? Indeed, there is. A research question is, well, your research question is based on your research problem. So once you have put forth what is the problem, so if you're looking at a specific topic, let's give an example, for instance, literacy levels in primary schools. There's low literacy. So your problem statement would look at what is the problem, when is it a problem, where is it a problem, for who's it a problem, and what happens if we don't address the problem. Now, based on that problem, you will then develop your questions. So there is, it's two different aspects in your chapter 1. In your proposal, you will always have a research problem, and based on that problem, you will have objectives and questions. So yes, they are very different. Okay, just want to go back. I think I might have skipped some. Can research questions, objectives, and hypotheses be used in one study? In MMR, yes, definitely. So in your quantitative project, you could test hypotheses. In the qualitative, you could then you could look at experiences, exploring those, but any design, whether it's qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods, all research will have a research problem statement. They'll all have research objectives, and all designs will have research questions. So it's not whether it's used in one study or not. Your overall study would have all of these aspects, maybe just in different projects, but the overall project will have its research questions and objectives, and that goes for any design. Can we apply MMR on design science research studies? I'm not that afraid with design science research studies, but I would imagine yes, because a design science research, if you are using quantitative, qualitative aspects to data, then yes, you could. If you start collecting data with qualitative design while planning to collect another set of data with a qualitative design, how to determine the correct sample? Okay, there's a hands up, so or okay, sign. I'm just not quite sure if you start collecting data with qualitative or planning to collect another set of data with qualitative design. How do you determine the correct sample size? So with qualitative research, we work on purpose of sampling. So your sample size would depend on when there's saturation. So you get no new information, and that would be if you are using two sets of qualitative data, it would be the same for each. It's when you reach saturation. And that could be different for different studies. So when there's no new information, usually at about 8 interviews or about 3 or 4 focus groups, and then you might do additional 2 or 3 just to make sure there's no new information. So in qualitative, the sample sizes are smaller. It could potentially become a little bigger if you are using different populations, or for instance, looking in an educational context, and you interview educators, and you interview students, and you interview administrators. So there you might have for each population 8 or 10, and that maybe might amount to 30 or 40, where if you just have one population, different phases, both qualitative, it's around 8 to 10 potentially for each phase. So, but your key there is your data saturation. How do you do the integration? Is that you will use the qualitative findings to explain quantitative findings. Yes, so the integration can take place at multiple places in your project. So it's possible that, as you suggested, the qualitative findings explain the quantitative, where this is more when you want to confirm. But there also is a stage where you use both the qualitative and the quantitative findings, and you integrate those to answer your research question. So it's about answering your research questions. And remember, for mixed method research design, there would be research questions for each phase, quantitative, qualitative. And then the integration is when you put these two types of data together. And that could then either explain your findings, or it could lead to a meta inference, or a conclusion in terms of your research questions. So I hope that the integration is a bit clear, but please also read up on it. It's really just, if you are aware, and as I mentioned with the very first question, what's the biggest mistake, is that the integration doesn't take place at some stage. All right, so it's when you combine the two data sets to answer your research questions. Okay. Okay, then I think I've gone through these. Okay, I've done the. Good day, Prof. What is the acceptable number of years to complete your PhD? Do I have you worried now? The full-time students have between 3 and 5 years. Now, I don't think there's any full-time student in UNISA. So you have between 4 and 7 years max, but 7 is really going on the far end. You must also remember that these years are provided by the Department of Higher Education, so it's not something that even the university's thumb sucks. It is a directive, and the Department of Higher Education also only subsidize, or the university will only receive a subsidy up to 5 years. If your study takes longer than 5 years, they lose that subsidy. So also another thing is, you don't want to be busy with this for the rest of your life. There's very compelling reasons for you to try and at least complete in 5 years tops. Some of the reasons is that, for instance, if you take 5 years to complete your study, by the 5th year, your literature review is dated. If you did it 5 years ago, so you need to repeat that, or you need to update that. If you collected your data, say in year 3, and you're only writing it up in year 5, that data might become dated as well. So there's many compelling reasons other than financial. You know that a PhD really consumes your life. I always compare it to a very jealous lover. It's in your head, it's in your bed, it's in when you bath, when you eat. You can't socialize properly because it's always here at the back of your head reminding you. So there's very compelling reasons for you to please try and do it in the minimum amount, and I would strongly suggest that it's max 5 years or even less. All right. Is it good to write conceptual papers from your literature review? Absolutely. Please do a proper literature review. For instance, also, literature reviews that are published and that's in demand, like integrative reviews, scoping reviews, systematic reviews. And there is training around these types of literature reviews. I don't know if I'm doing it, but in the past I also did that. But please do a solid literature review, and you can publish from that. That can be your first publication already. So remember, in a PhD, before the degree is conferred, if you registered after 2020, you need to give proof of 2 research papers submitted. So if you can get that out of the way, do it properly, and then you're well on your way to have your first publication. Katende, okay, sorry, I meant quantitative, but I think the answer is the same for both. Can we apply MMR on design research study? Okay, I think I answered that one at some stage. Okay, I think I've gone through most of the questions up to now. We still have some time left, so if you have any other questions or you need some clarification, you're still welcome to put it on the Q&A section. Just a reminder, you'll receive the link and you'll receive the slides so that you can refer back to them. Just see if there's other questions. So please, if you have anything else while I take a sip of water, now is the time. We still have some time left. So even if there is maybe any other questions that you have, maybe not pertaining to the specific focus of tonight, if there's anything else that I can maybe answer for you, or that's a burning problem at this stage, we can spend a few minutes on general questions as well. Otherwise, it seems that I was as clear as mud, and that I preempted potential questions already in the presentation. So there, yes, sometimes it seems mixed method research designs seems quite complex, which the design isn't necessarily complex. The problem is complex and the questions might be complex. But the design, once you've identified what is the question that you want to answer, in which sequence do you need to have your smaller projects within the larger project, then the execution of each project isn't that complex. It becomes more complex in the integration phase, and when we move to our higher order thinking in terms of meta inferences, high level conclusions, or our contributions, back to the conceptual phase of our research. So conceptual phase is in the beginning, when we work on our proposal and we conceptualize our project. And then there's a conceptualization phase, especially in your PhD towards the end again. So that calls for higher order thinking and learning skills like problem solving, critically thinking, comparing, contrasting, and that's where your inference comes in, is where you now start comparing, contrasting, inferring. Those are all higher order thinking skills. So the complexity is more in terms of the thinking, I think, than the design itself. So please don't let it put you off. If your research problem deserves, this complexity, to look at it and to answer it, then please go for this design. Yeah, it seems that there's no uptake for any further questions. If there's no other questions, then I bid you a good evening. All the best with your studies, and I will see you, I think, next month again, and the month thereafter. So all of the best while you're making your research design decisions, or in the future. For those master students that was maybe attending this evening, good insights for you to aspire to in your PhD studies. So all the best, take care, and we'll meet each other again. Goodbye.